know what the end of the world feels like? Well, sometimes I feel like I do, and I'm sure my fellow classmates would agree with me as well. It's that feeling after taking a test you know you could have done better on, or the moment that PowerSchool notification pops up on your screen. There are so many stresses that we deal with today, and one of those things is standardized testing. Before junior year, I had only heard about the woes of the SAT or the ACT from students before me. Now, I'm experiencing that firsthand, and let me tell you, I understand their complaints. Yes, you're partially correct in assuming that I'm only up here today speaking about the SAT or the ACT because I despise tests. But there is so much more to this argument than just a hatred for tests. Now, before I elaborate on that, let me address the other opinion of this issue. I asked a couple of my friends what they thought the value should be given to tests like the SAT and the ACT. And one of them responded by saying that it was necessary for colleges to understand the kind of student someone was, and for colleges to assess all incoming university freshmen on one scale. And I completely agree with that. But I am not here today to discuss completely eliminating tests like these, because I really do believe that they play a role in the college admissions process. What I am here today is to bring up the question of whether or not tests like these should hold so much power when they are fundamentally flawed. Should they be the make or break standards that determine a student's future? Now, I think the two most painfully blatant flaws with tests like these are that they don't take into account lingual and socioeconomic differences. By lingual differences, I mean the various and diverse languages spoken within America and across the world. There are over 350 languages spoken in America itself, and 10% of all American school students are English language learners. America is also the country with the highest number of international student enrollments in university. And in 2017, they made up 1.1 out of the 4.6 million students enrolled in American university. And the number is only rising. Spanish is the primary language spoken by 38.3 million people in America and is set to become the most common language by 2050. Oops. Now, I bring up all of these statistics because I think it's pertinent to note the diversity amongst American college applicants, where English may be the most common language spoken, but is usually not the only or even primary language spoken for students like myself. Children like me grow up speaking two languages, where English is usually not the most dominant ones in our early years. This probably means that we do not have the same foundations in the American English language that a child growing up in an English-only environment, per se, would. Now, after conducting some research on this theory of mine, I stumbled upon a study done by Erica Hoff, a developmental psychologist and professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University. Erica Hoff studied the effects of dual language exposure on the development of a bilingual child's proficiency in grammar and vocabulary, and compared those results to those of a monolingually developing child. In summary, she concluded that monolingually developing children were significantly more advanced than bilingually developing children in areas of vocabulary and grammar when comparing single languages, even when bilingually developing children had a wider range of vocabulary when combining the two languages they spoke. Now, this means that tests like the SAT, which have historically been known to curve their writing and language sections most, are inherently more difficult for bilingually developed children. And doing poorly on these sections is synonymous with a non-competitive score. Another factor that must be taken into account is curriculum focus in schools across the world. In the curriculum that I was a part of when I lived in India, our English classes were usually geared more toward analysis of literature rather than practicing grammar conventions or practicing writing. Acknowledging all of this information, I think all of us here can see that there are too many constituents that could explain a student's performance on these tests that wouldn't correlate to their intellect. So I really think it's important for us to rethink the value we give the SAT or the ACT in determining a student's intellect when in reality, it doesn't really measure it accurately at all. The other flaw, as I mentioned before, is the systematic inequality that disadvantages low-income students. Yes, I'm aware that there is a fee waiver available for low-income students, but there are so many more components that go into preparation for these tests than just paying for the test itself. Why do you think so many parents and students pay thousands of dollars for their children or themselves to receive tutoring for the SAT or the ACT? In many cases, it's not because their student is either deficient in math or English reading or writing. It is because the SAT and the ACT are uniquely structured exams that require at least a little guidance in order to be successful in for most students. Let me quote one of my friend's responses to the question I mentioned earlier. Quote, "Though the SAT or the ACT indicated some intellectual capacity, they more so just exacerbate the wealth disparity among students. Many people cannot afford tutoring or books or other resources that will give them an advantage during testing." Unquote. And that's the reality of our situation. I am fortunate enough that my parents are willing to and can pay for said tutoring or books, but it is yet another disadvantage for low-income families. Now, before I get my passive-aggressive self out of here, let me conclude with one last thing. Doing well on admissions tests like these is like the equivalent of receiving a hard-earned golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, but to the college of your dreams. And doing poorly on these exams is the end of the world for many students. But by redirecting some of the importance we give to these tests to more holistic demonstrations of a candidate's value, like their personal statement, or reviewing their extracurricular and academic life balance, this small, unfair, and limited world of college admissions has the potential to grow and encourage a fair, bright, and big future for students. Thank you.